Good morning. Let me add my welcome to all the other welcomes that you've heard this morning. I'm really thrilled to be moderating this particular panel. We have two wonderful speakers this morning and a very, very interesting topic as well. The way this will work, and this will be the same with the later panels, is that we'll have about a 25-minute presentation from each speaker, and then we'll have probably 20 minutes worth of questions at the end. I was thinking last night about the notion of federalism, which is what this panel is about, and I'm not going to waste a lot of time talking about it because you'll hear from our experts. But one thing that struck me is this is really clearly not a new thing. And I was thinking about 10 years ago, I was teaching constitutional law in Australia. Probably tell from my accent, I'm not from here. And we were thinking about the same things. We were thinking about the Federation of the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. And at that time there were issues about should New Zealand be part of the Federation. They had very different political and economic interests in the eastern seaboard of Australia. Western Australia wasn't too keen to participate because, again, you had a very different group of people and commercial and other interests there. Now, I'm sure that all of that wasn't nearly as contentious as what's happening in Iraq and Palestine and Israel and other countries around the world now. But it's interesting to see the development because from the seeds of what happened in Australia in 1901, you've actually had 100 years of debate about merging the Westminster system and the United States federal system in the written constitution and the different interests of the different groups. So these dynamics play themselves over and over again, and it was just an interesting thought I had as I was drifting off to sleep last night, looking forward to this morning's panel. So let me first start by introducing Professor Peter Schuck, who will be our first speaker. He is the Simeon E. Baldwin Professor of Law from Yale Law School, and we are thrilled to have him here. This is because of Dean Chodosh's great contacts, of course, that we get any of these wonderful people. I won't read his whole bio out to you, it's in the program. He has a wonderful array of political, academic, professional experiences, a huge list of publications on governance and citizenship. You see some of them listed in your program. A number of very impressive administrative appointments, which you see Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation in the Health, Education and Welfare Department, Consumers Union, Centre for the Study of Responsive Law. He's practiced in New York City and holds degrees from Cornell, Harvard, NYU and again from Harvard. So he's wonderfully qualified, has a wealth of experience to share with us this morning, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I will say that only Hiram Chodosh could get me to on a plane at 5:30 in the morning to come to Cleveland for less than a day. It is a great honor to be invited to participate in this program. Dean Korngold has put together a fabulous team here. I've seen it grow over time. I first visited the Cox Center probably 4 or 5 years ago, and I've kept aware of its development and its programmatic expansion. It's very, very exciting, and I'm glad to be able to participate. I'm also very delighted to be on a panel with Chibli Mallat. Most of you probably not heard him, but you will have the great pleasure of doing so. He's a wonderful speaker and a remarkable statesman in the Middle East, a man of great courage. Fortunately, because he's so knowledgeable about the Middle East, I can confine most of my examples to other systems. Although Iraq is obviously, the development of Iraq is obviously an occasion for rumination about federalism, and so I will make some allusions to that. Let me begin with some conceptual clarification, at least I hope it's clarification. It often turns out to be just the opposite, but some definitions in any event of some key terms that we'll be using today and some distinctions that we'll need to keep in mind. The first is federalism, and in an earlier article I defined it in a way that I think is useful, so let me just read from this. By federalism I mean a system that divides political authority between a nation-state and subnational polities within its territory, so that both the national and subnational polities directly govern individuals within their jurisdiction. Now, federalism involves devolution, but devolution does not necessarily involve federalism, so we'll want to keep that in mind. And a third concept, a cognate concept, is decentralized administration. Again, one can have decentralized administration without federalism, so the UK, for example, is an excellent example of a polity that has devolved authority to some extent to the Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish subunits, but is not a federal system in any important sense of the word. Similarly, you have Germany, in which virtually all administrative authority is devolved to the Länder. There's almost none at the national level. So one of the important points that I will emphasize at the end is that federalism comes in many different forms. There are many variables that are combined in many different ways. So we ought not to think of federalism as a monolith, at least in its substantive manifestations. A second distinction is between nation and state. The subject of our deliberations today is nation building. I think what we probably really mean is state building. The building of a state depends upon a sense of nationality within that state, but nationalities and states are often at war, and a federal system has to regulate that war. So I think in building nations, we are really concerned with building the kinds of states that can contain those nations without suppressing those nations. Nations being collectivities of individuals who share some common commitment by reason of descent or language or culture or some other form of glue, as I will call it, that causes them to think of themselves as having a common destiny. That is, a state is more of a formal, structural idea. And then the third idea that's in the third concept that needs to be clarified in the title of this session is building, nation building. We also are concerned, I think, although we're talking about nation building, with nation maintaining. It is not enough to build a nation if the nation can't be maintained. And so, and today we see enormous pressures that are tending to fraction nations, and Russia is one obvious example. Iraq is another one. That is to say, we're talking about the way in which the new state of Iraq can be built, but we also understand that there are at least 3 nations within Iraq that are going to have to be contained somehow in a very creative way that Chibli Mallat will have more to say about. So we built a state. We, when I say we, I mean not the United States or even mainly the United States, but we participated. The building of a nation in Afghanistan. We're doing the same in Iraq, but the trick is not just building it, but maintaining it. So that's some conceptual underbrush that I hope is cleared away. The next point I want to make is that there are a number of different glues or bases of nationhood, and each of these operates in a rather different way from one another, and the coexistence of them in one particular structure of a nation makes for some very complex problems. One is language. Language is perhaps the most important glue in building a nation, but is often a source of great discord within a nation state. So we'll have to keep that in mind. Indeed, it's true of virtually all of the elements of, all of the glues of nationhood, that they can also, and inevitably do, create pressures for fragmentation to destroy the nation, that might destroy the nation state. A second is religion. Poland would be a good example of religion as constituting the essential element of Polishness, or at least a very important part of that conception of Polishness that constitutes it as a nation. A third glue, in addition to language and religion, would be a sense of common patrimony. The idea that the nation does have a common past and a common future. This common patrimony often exists more in myth than in reality. It is often a function of accident, as distinguished from planning. Sometimes it's a result of a prolonged dictatorship. So, for example, Stalin created a sense of nationhood in the Soviet Union, partly by force, partly because of his role in World War II and in waging the Great Patriotic War. And we also know from cultural historians that the notion of nationhood is often a product of myth creating and myth sustaining. Many of the traditions that are associated with what we now take to be nation states, like the UK, are actually of relatively recent origin and were designed at the time partly out of response to particular historical contingencies, but partly out of a self-conscious strategic effort by the leaders of those times to forge a sense of nationhood. A fourth kind of glue is constitutionalism, both in terms of the Constitution being the constituting, by definition, constituting instrument of a nation, but also because of the struggles that often precede the adoption of a constitution, military struggles and political struggles, ideological struggles, of the kind that we see in Iraq today. But at the end of those struggles, constitution can often become the symbol, indeed the metonym, the actual representation of the rule of law and of the nation. And then the last glue I'll mention, although there are others to be considered, is the importance of external threats, real, imagined, or contrived. And we see this all over. We certainly see this in some would say that the sense of nationhood in the United States, while certainly strong prior to World War II, was very much increased by World War II and by the Cold War that followed, and perhaps now by the war on terrorism. So this external enemy is a very important part of nationhood in virtually all cases. Now, there are many techniques of nation building, and I will just tick off a number of them, and then settle on for the rest of my remarks on federalism. One technique of nation building is the subordination of minorities, as we have seen in Turkey, for example. The repression of the Kurds has been an important part of Turkish identity. We saw the same thing in the former Yugoslavia, where Tito created a sense of Yugoslav nationalism that had never existed before and, of course, doesn't exist anymore. Then there's the United States experience, the expansion, the conquest of territory, creating a kind of national myth and a base, a territorial base for nationhood. Leadership, which I want to emphasize at the very close of my remarks, is an extraordinarily important technique of nation building. Indeed, it may be the sine qua non of successful nation building, and that has taken a variety of forms. Sometimes it's charismatic leadership, sometimes it's dynastic leadership, sometimes it's moral, as in the case of Gandhi and Nehru or Mandela in contemporary South Africa, and sometimes it's military. So that leads me to the most important technique for present purposes of nation building, which is federalism. Now, federal systems, it seems to me, have an historical dimension, and I'm now speaking schematically, and Chibli Mallat will speak more in a more focused way on particular systems in the Middle East. But if we look across systems, we can see that historically federal systems originate in four ways. The first is when a pre-existing polity decides to federate. Switzerland is a federal system, a very rich federal system in many ways, that consisted of cantons that came together to form a federation. The same is true of the United States with the colonies. A second historical pattern is when federal systems are formed under imperial auspices. So Australia is an important example of that, as is Canada. A third historical pattern is when a nation state creates a federal system, an existing nation state creates a federal system along cultural lines, as in the case of Belgium, or along political lines, as in the case of the United States when it expanded west and created new states. And then the fourth historical circumstance is conquest. The Federal Republic of Germany is the product, its federal system is the product of conquest. The Länder, by and large, were not established along the pre-existing political boundaries of any particular pre-1945 polity, with a few exceptions like Bavaria. But they were formed according to the patterns of occupation by the Allies and for a variety of administrative and military reasons that the conquering powers had emphasized. Before I reach my conclusion, I want to spend a bit of time considering the structural features of federalism. And first, I want to emphasize the ambivalent relationship that federalism bears to nation building. That is to say, as I said before, that the kinds of forces that prompt the creation of a federal system are the very forces that may prevent the nation from, once established, from perpetuating itself. And it creates the same sorts of fractionating, disaggregating forces. So what are the underlying dynamics that conduce to the creation of a federal system? Well, I think the most important is probably the underlying sociological pluralism or diversity of the civil society in which the political design decisions are being made. One tends to find in federal systems societies that are extraordinarily pluralistic to begin with. So it's not a surprise that those societies reflecting the diversity of their populations economically, sociologically, religiously, and culturally would seek to recognize those pre-existing pluralisms in a political form. Secondly, there are certain economies of scale and certain diseconomies of scale in political formations, and here I want to emphasize the diseconomies of scale that lead a polity to try to devolve power to smaller units. There are a number of areas in which smaller is more effective or better or fairer in political governance. And we tend to emphasize, in the past, have tended to emphasize the economies of scale, that is to say, the reasons why you want to move from a local to a national or from a national to a supranational formation. But I think what we're learning is that those economies of scale can often be exaggerated and mask the importance of smaller units for achieving certain kinds of efficiencies and senses of fairness. Minority group demands are among the most important reasons for the establishing of federal systems. Demand for patronage is also an important source of federal system, perhaps in some ways the most important, other than the diversity of civil society with which I began. And another very important structural feature that explains why we have federal systems in some areas and not in others is the territorial concentrations of pluralistic civil societies. That is to say, the fact that there are lots of people of a particular religion or a particular linguistic group, or people whose economic activity is common, are clustered in particular regions within the larger polity, tends to improve their bargaining power and their sense of distinctiveness and their demands for self-determination. So what is it that can be devolved in a federal system? There are at least 5 sorts of categories that I think are useful to think about. One is the control of physical resources. Now, in Iraq, as Chibli will probably discuss, one of the most important the most important physical resource is oil, and the struggle over the federal structure of Iraq is certainly going to pivot around the decision as to who gets the oil and what amount of revenue sharing will result, because the Kurds control a good deal of it in the region around Kirkuk, and this may also lead to what has been called in international economic analysis the curse of oil. That is to say, the oil being an extraordinarily rich resource for economic development and for patronage and for a variety of other means by which nations build themselves, but it can also lead to civil war and indeed invasion by third parties. So control of physical resources is a very important thing that can be devolved and is the subject of negotiation in the construction of a federal system. A second is control of cultural or ethnicity. Here the most important decisions have to do with language and perhaps dress, as we see in France, decision over whether young women can wear the veil in public schools, that sort of thing, patterns of worship, and the like. A third set of things that can be devolved is the control of law or politics or other public functions. That's the most obvious one. When we speak of the construction of federalism, we're usually talking about those structural divisions of legal and political authority. But I think what is really going on in most of those situations is a struggle over control of these other resources, and the political structure often is little more than a reflection of that division. A fourth would be control of military forces. And here again, Iraq is a very interesting example, because one of the decisions that must be made is whether the Kurds are going to be able to retain their own military force, as they are insisting, and whether and how their military force can be integrated with the national security forces that are being developed in Iraq. And then a fifth category is sort of a miscellaneous category. There are other kinds of concessions that the center can make to the subunits. And among the most important of these will be reflected in the electoral systems, the voting systems that are adopted in any particular polity. Again, to some extent, that system will be epiphenomenal, that is to say, reflective of other realities. You select a voting system largely on the basis of your sense of how you want power and these other resources distributed, but it can take on a life of its own. And one hopes that the voting systems that are adopted in newly federalizing societies like Iraq will be ones that encourage the kind of national patterns that one hopes to see. So under the transitional administrative law, the requirement for electing a government was 2/3 of the legislature. Very, very unusual provision, but that was designed to ensure that there would be an unusual amount of coalition building, consensus, and horse trading that would be necessary to sustain the government once it was in place. There are some relatively, and I emphasize the word relatively successful models of federalism to which we can look for some guidance as to how to construct new federal systems, although I emphasize that each system is very, very unique and the product of historical and cultural circumstances that cannot simply be exported from one to the other. But the main ones that I have in mind are the U.S., Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and India. But I want to emphasize how tentative some of these judgments must be. For example, Germany now, as some of you may have read in the last week's Economist magazine, is experiencing an economic crisis that many believe is rooted in the federal system that was imposed on Germany after World War II by the Allies, and that in order to reform its economy, it's going to have to reform the federal system and give less power to the Bundesrat, which basically exercises a veto power over any kind of change of any significance in federal policy. Similarly, India, where Hiram and I have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years, is a nation with a very robust federal system, but one that threatens to undermine the nation in some important respects through corruption, through the demand for patronage, through linguistic self-determination movements, and so forth. I say I just have a couple of minutes left, so let me now move to the threats to federal systems. The first is the reinforcement of cleavage by the structure of the federal system itself. And here it's interesting to compare the federal system of Canada and the federal system of the United States. In a very general sense, and I could illustrate if I needed to, the United States is a federal system that tends to smooth over pre-existing cleavages, to transcend them, to mute them, whereas the Canadian system is one that actually exaggerates or reinforces the pre-existing cleavages that produced the federal system in the first place. That's true as a constitutional matter. It's true in some other respects as well. So a very important design decision of any federal system is whether to adopt, in making concessions to the subunits for some of the reasons I suggested before, it's important not to reinforce strengthen the sources of disaggregation at the same time. A second threat is the change in conditions that put a strain on the original bargain that produced the federal system. Here again, Germany, a good example. The original bargain may have to be renegotiated in order to deal with the new challenges of the German economy. A third threat is the oppression of minorities within the subnational units, which often produces a pretext for invasion by outside groups, as in Russia, dealing with threatening to invade the Baltics, and of course successfully invading the Baltics during the pre-World War II period, but even today threatening the Baltics because of their treatment of Russian minorities there. Chechnya, another example there. The U.S. Civil War was an example, when you think about it, of a national polity invading some of the subnational polities, the southern states, in part to protect the minorities, the blacks within those states. The Anglophobia of the Quebec province has also created strains of that kind. My time's just about up, so just let me quickly run through just a couple of things, and then I'll stop. The gross inequalities among subunits may create strains on the federalism, just as in Germany, where the Eastern Länder have had such displayed such economic underdevelopment, and this particular strain had a lot to do with Chancellor Kohl's defeat in 1998. And we see this in Spain, we see it in Italy, we see it in India as well. Outsider interventions can be an important threat to a federal system. Well, I'm out of time. I won't give examples, and I'll just conclude by making a couple of points. First, federalism can ease the path to nationhood, but it is ultimately epiphenomenal. That is to say, it has to reflect, it is more reflective of underlying political, social, cultural conditions than itself an independent variable. Second, everything depends upon the structural details of a federal system, details going to the allocation of particular powers, the protection of minorities, the voting systems that are established, the economic inequalities that exist and that are tolerated or perhaps even exaggerated by the federal system, the underlying pluralism of the civil society, and then this question, as I mentioned before, about whether the federal system reinforces or transcends pre-existing differences. And the final point I want to make is that what matters most in a federal system in terms of nation building is the political culture of nationhood, and that ultimately the existence of this political culture of nationhood is a great mystery. It's not something that can be designed. It's not something that we fully understand. It has an affective and emotional component. It's historically conditioned, as in the struggles against colonialism or the effect, as I said, in the case of USSR, of the Great Patriotic War. And it's also, my final point, a product of leadership. And that leadership can be very constructive, as in the case of Nelson Mandela and his embrace of the Springbok soccer team when he donned a green jersey and became a symbol of racial conciliation at a time when it could have easily gone the other way and devolved into civil war. And at the other end, Milosevic, who exercised his leadership in a way in the former Yugoslavia that destroyed any possibility of national building or perpetuation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping this mic is on so I can save time by sitting here. Hopefully we'll get to some of those other points that Professor Schuck didn't get to in the Q&A session following Professor Mallat's remarks. It's also a tremendous honour this morning to be able to introduce Professor Chibli Mallat. He is the Jean Monnet Professor in European Law and the Director of the Centre of European Union Law Studies at the Université Saint-Joseph. He, again, has tremendous amount of practical experience all over the world. He's a leading expert in Middle Eastern law and particularly on Islamic law, and I believe some of his remarks will be particularly focused at the Middle East issues today. He's been a law professor both in London and in Beirut. He's published in European, American and Arab law issues in various publications and various jurisdictions, and you have a list of some of his major publications in your bio, in your handout, and he's currently working on a restatement of Kant's Treaty on Perpetual Peace. I won't paraphrase any more of his bio now in the interests of turning it over to him for his remarks.
Thank you so much. Well, it's both a joy and a privilege to be with you this morning, not only because of the number of friends, Hiram, of course, Joanne, Peter Schuck, who gave us this masterful brush of federalism-related problems across the world. But it's also particular because I sense myself coming out from Lebanon, from having spent most of the last month on the streets with my students, as a messenger of a different Middle East, a Middle East which is not the one that we have known for the past 100 years, built upon violence and bloodletting, but a Middle East where the most important tool for change is nonviolent. So to this, there is a calling that comes with the prescient reflection that Hiram has invested in this conference today, because we are at this particular juncture where thought can be effective. must be effective for putting this transition in the Middle East from the horrors that we have witnessed there and here, I must say, in the past decades, to at least this glimmer of hope that Michael Schaaf introduced us with this morning. And in this context, the title of my talk is, I think, indicative. It's Federalism and Nation Building, and I would like to talk to you about the Middle East constitutional impasse. Now, these remarks are variations on a talk on Lebanon offered at the World Bank earlier this week. And reading and reflecting through that talk, which dealt with constitutionalism beyond the current crisis in Lebanon, underlined the conviction that there may be a model of constitutionalism in the making in that part of the world which challenges all received models since Montesquieu and the Federalist Papers defined the new world of political science in the second half of the 18th century. This is not a mean hypothesis, but let us try rising to its provocative peak with some of the conclusions in that talk on Lebanon. One first dimension is the similarity of the political deadlocks across the region, including as diverse cultures and societies as Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Algeria, Sudan, just to name countries of the impending arc of crisis. It extends arguably to Pakistan and India and to many African countries that face that same conundrum of social political conviviality. While one is always wary of sweeping generalizations, a common thread across these societies is the strong presence of Islam, and there may be one of the overarching elements of a real clash of civilizations, which could be defined for our purposes as a contrastive model of personal as opposed to territorial law. Law in the modern nation-state is eminently territorial. Within one's boundaries is a dominant legal system which is by definition exclusive of any other. All are bound by that system, and they become bound by the next door system as soon as they cross that international boundary. In the received world of Islamic law, there are traits which may resemble this territoriality, the divide of some classical lawyers between Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Silm or Dar al-Islam, the war territory as opposed to the peace or Islam territory. But relation to the law, even within that scheme, tend to be far more strongly personal than it is territorial. One carries under the scheme one's attachment to the law wherever one goes. While this is not completely unknown to an American or a French national who's bound, for instance, by fiscal laws of his or her country, irrespective of territory, personal law is not the dominant relation outside one's country. This sort of generalization may be tried with examples or counterexamples strengthening or weakening assumptions that the theory often renders unnecessarily rigid. But there's one component which, in my view, is decisive and which grounds the issue of personality versus territoriality of laws in a special mold of Middle East federalism. This mold is at the root of the difficulty present nation-states in the region confront for the future of their people. The difficulty may convincingly put in terms of communitarian versus territorial federalism. Let us start with Lebanon. Constitutionalism beyond the Cedar Revolution means first taking stock of the Lebanese Constitution. The Lebanese Constitution is full of flaws, no one will deny that, but it's also a formidable constitution, and its longevity, almost a century, is not an accident of history. There is a structural characteristic of Lebanese society which this constitution has taken into account to survive this long, and it's not wise to mess lightly with deep historical structures. These structures are derogatorily, sorry, it's a barbaric word, negatively known as sectarianism or communitarianism, confessionnalisme in French, ta'ifiyya in Lebanese Arabic. This means that the relationship between the citizen and the state is not an immediate, direct one. It is filtered by his or her community. In that case, in the case of Lebanon, one of the 18 or so sects that make up officially the country, an impossible realm of combinations which may be simplified by the great divide between Muslim and Christian, and by the sometimes no less powerful divide between Sunnis, Shi'is, and Maronites, the three larger communities in the country. I prefer to call this complex sociological constitutional situation positively and somewhat incorrectly communitarian federalism. However frustrating, we must approach the Lebanese constitution positively. The system in Lebanon is not an all-bad system, and people who sneer at it may see in the ongoing Iraqi debate on the constitution why they should reconsider. It's a correct assumption, widely held and full of merit, that matters of governance in Iraq will not be stable, that is good, if the Sunni community is not represented in the decision-making process. This actually is the Lebanese constitutional litmus test. However bad a community may be perceived, it will retain under the constitution representation in government. So when we suggest deep structures, we're not only talking about Lebanon, as the Lebanese model offers a very Middle Eastern archetype. This archetype replicates the personal as opposed to territorial model in the rest of the region. I will not unduly provoke you by offering the example of Palestine-Israel, namely that a discrete and insular, historically victimized minority called the Israeli Arabs, representing a fifth to a quarter of the population, has never had serious executive representation in the Israeli government. Under a Lebanese-like model, they are entitled to some 5 central cabinet posts. When that happens, and it will one day happen, like it has happened with Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice in this country after 200 years of victimization, there will be no longer an Arab-Israeli problem as has plagued us since 1948. Now, one may balk at the Israeli example, but this is a problem which we shut our eyes to, and this imperviousness makes our approach ostrich-like to an extent unparalleled in the approach to any other society in the world, and I mean the Jewishness by definition of the State of Israel. It has always struck me in the legal and sociological study of Israel how Jewishness is granted to be the exclusive characteristic of the country. Because of the obvious historic legacy of the Holocaust, this is an issue which is overwhelmingly seen as the be-all and the end-all of Israel as a state. By any scientific assessment, and we shall restrict this overview to sociology and law, what appears to be granted that is not questioned is precisely the negative, nefarious dimension of the personal law model that makes up the Israeli constitution. Sociologically, we can illustrate it as the great generational divide between Baruch Kimmerling, the foremost sociologist of present-day Israel, as opposed to his one-time mentor and dean of the sociological studies of the previous half-century generation, Samuel Eisenstadt. The Eisenstadt school was interested only by the Jewish population of Israel and the sociological and cultural gap of Ashkenazi and Sephardim, Oriental and European Western Jews. By the time the first Intifada in 1988 followed in the heels of the Day of the Land, the revolt of 1976, such analysis, in part, no doubt, the result of effective integration in the Jewish state by the roundabout way of the Likud of Sephardim and Ashkenazim, had become, if not wrong, at least secondary. As it turned out, the problem of Israel stands not between Jews from different diasporas, but between Jews and non-Jews in a country defined by law as a Jewish state, that is, a country defined by law personally rather than territorially. Now, in law, over a period of 50 years, with remnants of the debate still current for the latest wave of immigration, the Ethiopian and the Russian Jews, the central question for law in Israel was about, as you know, who is a Jew. For Christians and Muslims directly affected by the emergence of Israel, in the three strands of their victimization since 1948, that problem was out of order, because they are by definition out of the legal order of a state defined by its Jewishness. Three strands with their own difficult relation to the Israeli legal order make up for this victimization. For those who were evicted from their homes and never allowed to return, they simply do not exist in the eyes of Israeli law. These are the refugees of 1948, in law, perpetual and irrevocable absentees. For those who came in 1967 under occupation but were not evicted, a combination of laws of occupation and of slow and brutal expropriation hemmed them in their narrowing territories. For the 1/10 of the native population who was not evicted in 1948 and grew to become about 1 million souls today, the Israeli Arabs, as they are called, the Palestinian Israelis, as I think they should be more scientifically depicted, the Jewishness of the State of Israel has meant that the political process at the bottom was made available by an absolute right to vote, and this is important, but that executive representation at the top remained constrained tightly by a combination of harsh legal rules and by an overt discrimination against citizens who, not being Jew, are considered by the Jewish majority at best as a nuisance, at worst as a threat that requires the transfer outside the state. Back to Lebanon's deeper constitutional structures. 4 years ago, some of the earlier drafts of the 1926 Constitution were released, and they are sobering. Two texts stand in open contradiction. Article 7 of the would-be Constitution then, and its Article 95. In Article 7, like any other country, all people are equal. In Article 95, the communities, that is, the religious communities, must be respected and recognized as legal agents or intermediaries. This has not changed, except that present Article 95 has established parity between Christians and Muslims in Parliament, away from a 6-5 formula, that is, you multiply 6 and 5 for Christians, Muslims by 5, every time you make up for a new parliament, a formula that prevailed until the process of ending the civil war, in part a constitutional process known as the Ta'if Agreement in 1989. Well, it would be wrong to think that the scheme of community recognition as legal agents stops even at 1926. We have been able to discover the very early prototype of Lebanese constitutionalism, a text that goes back to 1836, and a text which establishes municipal councils, that is, representation plus executive power in the major cities, then Saida in the south, on the basis of parity between the number of Christian and Muslim councilmen. Parity in representation between Muslims and Christians from 1836 to 1989 or 2005, this, by most historical measures, is a deep structure. To simply jettison it under the name of individual equality, however the merit of the approach, and despite the Cedar Revolution, which is in many ways asking for a departure from that ancient mold, is in our view unwarranted, if at all feasible. But the next government and the spirit of the law it will carry cannot simply take the Lebanese constitution as it stands, with the deep merit imbalance to which complications must be added, that is, the democratic shifts which further unsettle it. It requires improvements which retain the better part of the system, its corrective representation of the risks of exclusive majoritarianism, yet allow merit to obtain irrespective of the communitarian straitjacket. Federalism, in the constitutional concepts available to human thought, offers ways forward, and the Middle East national system should be, in our opinion, brought up to an effective federalist level. Now, federalism, in any system that constitutionalist lawyers can recognize on the planet, is usually, I don't know, Peter will correct me, I think actually inevitably, but I might have missed a nuance somewhere on the planet, the system of federalism is always territorial. With federalism following territory and history, you have Rhode Island and California coexisting happily in the Senate as equals. We're talking here not about power of Rhode Islanders and Californians in their respective states, which is a minor issue since no one disputes the fact that Californians have no business running Rhode Island or vice versa, but power at the center in Washington. And we're talking mainly about the legislative branch under a system of a relatively strict separation of powers. Now, California takes the revenge of numbers over Rhode Islands in other ways, but the territorial arrangement is evident in the ultimate solution and will give way generally when it comes to the executive branch to an electoral college with a few exceptions, like in Florida 2000, brings the person chosen by the majority of people to the helm, with a case of Californians and Rhode Islanders' individual voices counting almost equally at the polls. Sociologically, federal distortion is also lessened by two key phenomena that do not readily appear in the Middle East mosaic, that is political parties and significant movement of individuals and families across the United States. Here appears what we consider the many difficulties of constitutionalism beyond the sociological setup in Lebanon, Iraq, Israel, and the Middle East generally, when one is trying to implement the principle of full equality between two citizens within any one of these countries. In the Middle East, federalism, to be meaningful, must give way to corrective representation by way of communities standing in lieu of states, and this is a non-territorial scheme by and large. This is not an easy scheme to implement because of the above complications, but there is more. Now, could the solution be territorial if only by ruse? The answer is that it depends, and it may be useful to bring in here the Iraqi constitution in the making with the choices it must exercise before the summer is over. One can make a natural case of a bistatal federal Iraq, Kurds in the north, Arabs in the center and south. We know that it does not work, however, because the sect re-emerges in the form of Sunnism in the center and south, and the obvious problem is that populations are interwoven, people move about, and while there remain majorities, often dominant in a given territory, cities and the urban trend, which was a universal sociological trait in the 20th century, blur that alleged purity. In Lebanon, what sort of territorial purity is there? Arguably, the stretch between Beirut and Zgharta in the north, east to Zahli and Deir al-Ahmar, is predominantly Christian, and one can imagine a federal state with one component following that geographical trapeze, an essentially Christian one, and the rest of the country chiefly Muslim. Some Nigerian-like arrangement would follow, but it's a costly one on stability and fairness. Beirut, with perhaps half of the Lebanese population, is one serious conundrum, unless one wishes to divide it again, which would be a disaster. The rest of the country is also a problem. Whether it's Djezin in the south, it's a city with a large Christian community, or Qubayat in the Akkar, which is in the far north. Now, we should look at the possibilities of communitarian federalism by territorial rules more seriously, and always bearing in mind that communitarian federalism requires territories which are homogeneous, which is not always available, and when they are, result from forms of ethnic cleansing which no one wishes to consecrate in law. Even when such territories appear to be homogeneous, the problem gets translated on their borders, as we can see in Kirkuk in Iraq, in Jerusalem in Israel-Palestine, or in the southern suburbs of Beirut nowadays, which have a predominantly Shi'i composition. So the central problem for federalism in Iraq, Lebanon, or Israel is also thornier than elsewhere in the world, since the issue tends not to be separation of powers in the three executive branches of government, but the fight in the center over executive power. Executive power is a nightmarish puzzle by nature, as Robespierre had seen it 200 years ago. You cannot have executive power if you have only part of it. Executive power requires, by essence, one executive chief with the power to rule by majority. It is simply ineffective, let alone fair, to deprive people from their right to a president, to one president chosen by universal suffrage. I have no answer to that conundrum, and we should examine various forward schemes. My sense is that the presidential triumvirate of Iraq is unworkable, and that a bicephalous arrangement on a dual ticket might deliver a ruse away from communitarianism that combines well with universal suffrage in the choice of the CEO of the country. This might sound bewildering and unduly complex. One shouldn't allow for the Lebanese, Iraqi, or Israeli and other mosaics to cloud one's moral principles on the basic equality amongst citizens. It might help to put the issue in simple words, namely that the individual's allegiance in Lebanon and elsewhere in the region is dual in law. He or she operates nationally as constitutional citizen in a Habermas fashion. But he or she also relates to public affairs through religious sectarian belonging, which is the community as agent. To be fair, the Lebanese constitutionalists at Ta'if were seeing it clearly, and the idea of a community representative Senate as opposed to a non-communitarian parliament is a decent and workable response at the level of the legislative branch. The problem is that it deals with legislative power, and executive power remains beyond its pale. In Lebanon, in Beirut, in Baghdad, in Jerusalem, community allegiance tends to trump the national one, but it isn't always necessary that it be so. And there are moments of forward movement, like in the place of martyrs' freedom in Beirut as it unfolds, like in Iraq on the 30th of January, where the national dedication is palpable beyond the communitarian straitjacket. Each one will have his or her own choice of being conservative or revolutionary. To be conservative means sticking to the community safety valve. Being revolutionary is to jettison the system in favor of citizenship and equality. For middle-aged, middle-class adventurers like myself, the choice is that real communitarian federalism should be pursued, which has put us on the side of the non-violent revolution underway in Beirut, albeit with less idealism than our students on the streets. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers this morning. It just raises a whole lot of questions. I could sit here for 15 minutes and actually ask questions of each speaker, but we do have 15 minutes for questions, so does anyone have questions for either speaker?
Professor Schuck, how fine... Can you hold on a second? We have another room full of another 100 people that are watching it, so we need to have a microphone so that they can hear what you ask. Thank you. Yes, for Professor Schuck, how fine a line is it between federalism and the creation of an independent state? If we're looking at a situation like India, we could have left Pakistan in there as a federal system as a separate state, and if the different glues you were talking about are conflicting, how is that decision ideally to be made?
Well, I'm afraid that the emotional component is at least as important as the rational or political component. I was in Kashmir earlier in 2004, and I met with many students there, and I asked them if they had their druthers, how would they organize their political community? And I expected most of them to say, I expected all of them to say, as they did, we would be independent. We'd be an independent nation of Kashmir. I said, well, that's not likely to happen. You'd be landlocked. It would not economically viable and so forth. That as between being part of India and being part of Pakistan, which would you prefer? And I expected most of them to say India because as just a practical matter, India is a successful adventure, and it has a future that's bright, I think, notwithstanding all of its difficulties, whereas Pakistan is very much of a failed state and getting worse. almost to a person, they said they would rather be part of Pakistan. I said, why? And they said, because we're Muslims. They had other objections to India, but that seemed to be the main glue. Those sorts of tribalistic commitments are extraordinarily powerful, and they tend to overwhelm the kinds of considerations that we as outsiders and as system designers might think would be more important. So the line is not one that can be drawn in any kind of entirely rationalistic way. But if I were to design it, I would look at the kinds of factors that I identified: the glues, and then the forces of dissolution, and try to find a balance among them, and also emphasize, as I said, those institutions and those ideologies which will transcend the divisions rather than reinforce them. And it's very difficult to create a robust federal system that doesn't reinforce the divisions.
Other questions for the panel? Is there a mic up there?
My question is for both panelists, and it's regarding the place of religious law or religion in the law in the drafting of the Iraqi Constitution. I think that is on par with the issues of federalism that the state will be addressing. And with the Sunni exclusion or lack of inclusion in the drafting or in their interests, what do you foresee? Or as particularly on the note that Professor Mallat stated, is this, however problematic and all these bumps along the way, should we just take it as it comes as part of the growing pains of developing a constitution?
Let me speak very briefly. I'll let him say more about this because he knows so much more. One of the difficulties in the distinction that you're drawing between the religious and political divisions within the country is that they often coincide. They coincide territorially. And so a federal system that, as Professor Mallat said, is invariably territorial in its basis and structure, also is designed to concentrate communities of religion and language, thereby reinforcing the divisions. So the same sorts of structural design decisions, as I'm calling them, that make concessions to religious communities often coincide with the kinds of concessions that result in political power over a particular territory, control over certain resources that the center might want, and other sources of friction.
Well put, Peter, and this is an obvious problem in Iraq, which you heard discussed slightly in the paper also. But your question is very powerful because it englobes actually the two main problems that drafting a constitution for Iraq entails. The first one is religion as community, and we've talked about this. I really don't think we'll be able, as assistants to the drafting process of our Iraqi colleagues, to anticipate in clarity what the shape of things will be by the summer, because a lot of it is political and has to do with the strength and horse trading that's taking place and will start taking place as soon as the government is designated within 2 weeks. In other words, the issue of where the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds, how they will organize their federal country, because there is an understanding now, which is even enshrined in a Security Council resolution, that it's going to be federal. But very simple question. I've worked a lot, as Hiram and Joanne and Peter, with the Iraqi opposition very early on, with the understanding that the shape of the power to come will have to do a lot with the structure of the political opposition in Iraq. And there were Kurds, Sunnis, and Shias. And from the very beginning, that is, I'm talking about our meeting in June 1992 that created the first Iraqi National Council in Vienna, we had a big problem with the absence of serious Sunni representation. Now, the tripartite arrangement that you'll see now in the transitional administrative law comes back from that time, and you were unable to come up with a different scheme that would include all three communities. But this tripartite leadership, which at the time consisted of Jalal Talabani, who's now become president, and exactly the very same profiles that you see now in power. And that's why I say I don't have a solution. It's not been easy. It's not been easy when they were in opposition, and it's not going to be easy now. And there's going to be a lot of political push and pulls throughout. The most important thing is that it is not violent. As long as it's not violent, then it's fine. It's part of the process. But I don't see that the result will be any different, frankly, from what we have in the transitional administrative law. And in my view, it's not working. We should try to do something else, and that's where I'm seeing a possible dual ticket that naturally would produce a president and a vice president from different national or sectarian characteristics. So long as this person, and it's not the case now, this ticket is chosen by the whole population. So, I really think that a further stage of democracy, a necessary stage of democracy, which you've enjoyed here for the past 200 years, has been people elsewhere in the world have been shown from it in the main, and that is the people directly choose their head. So it's not done like it is done now, with you have parliament and then parliament chooses the president or the prime minister. So maybe this may be a way to break through that the weight of the religion as a defining feature in a tripartite agreement, which can never work at the head. No. You will see, if Ghazi, for instance, puts his foot down today on any issue, government stops in Iraq. There's a veto system there, where unless the three are in agreement on whatever they consider basic issues, the system just collapses. The other element of your question, I'm a bit long, is solvable in my view, and perhaps the most creative in our attempt to move forward on the constitution in Iraq and in the Middle East. And that is the place of Islamic law in the system. And not Islamic law as what I call an acid test, whether a woman should be veiled or whether inheritance should be pursued in accordance strictly with the Quranic lines that give twice to the daughter, twice to the son than to the daughter. These are problems which I don't think are just an epiphenomenon. What is lacking, what has been lacking in constitutionalism in the past 150 years of constitutionalism in the Middle East is the Islamic law tradition. But it's much more a matter of style than a matter of content. I think no one will, in Iraq or elsewhere, dispute the fact that there are standard, basic, universal values that must be protected. No torture, the right to vote, and so forth. This will be accepted. The problem that we've had is that the language in which that has been used has been predominantly Western, at a time when we have in the Middle East a formidable Islamic law tradition, which has dealt with these in a particular language that we don't see in our constitutions. So a lecture that I gave a couple of weeks ago with a person who's going to be a major drafter of the Constitution, Hassan Chalabi, a very respected professor of law, was precisely to make a bit of progress on this, which is to say, look, let's take all these universal values, but couch it in a language that is Arabic, Islamic, so that people can identify with that much more readily than they will identify with the translation of a charter which has been designed in the West.
I'd like to add one point that hasn't been mentioned, and it's a bit peripheral to the question you raised, but I think it's extremely important and ought to be brought into the conversation, and that is, I'm struck by the extent to which nation building through federalism today is strongly influenced by outside forces. I don't think historically this has been nearly the case. One can look at the importance of the French to the American Revolution and the importance of the British the negotiations with the British in our Civil War and so forth. So there are always foreign policy influences shaping the creation of a federal system as a nation-building device. But I think we are unprecedented today in the extent to which events outside the country shape the nation-building process. So just consider as an example the fact that much of what occurs in Iraq is being influenced by decisions made in Brussels. Why Brussels? Because the EU's pressure on Turkey is what's accounting for any change that we may observe, and it may not be adequate, in Turkey's relationships to the Kurds. Turkey is very concerned about the power of the Kurds in Iraq because they fear that any autonomy given to the Kurds in Iraq will excite the Kurds in Turkey. So Turkey's attitude toward the Kurds has been somewhat neutralized by its concern for its alliance with the United States and its desire to enter the EU, and that's going to affect the shadow that it casts over Iraq as Iraq develops its federal system. And I think this is endemic today, that outside, especially in the Middle East, that outside forces play an extraordinarily important role in what might otherwise seem to be an internal domestic bargain.
We have time for perhaps one final question. Is there a microphone we can quickly get down here?
Thank you. My question has to do linking economics to federalism, and aren't they in the economic source of standard of living of a country as it changes over time a big driver in federalism, and in particular of importance to me is the Peter Drucker and Michael Porter have said we're right in the midst of a sea change in the economies to a knowledge economy, which celebrates diversity, unique civilizations. And if you'd comment on that link of economics to federalism and ideally the knowledge economy that we're in the middle of shifting to.
I think it's critical for the obvious reason that most of the countries that are developing nation-building strategies and nascent federal systems are very poor countries, and they have to be concerned about their ability to survive through their economic future. But it is also the case, and so the struggle emphasizes several aspects of the economic issue. One is the control over resources that I mentioned before, oil being particularly important in Iraq, but diamonds being very important in Central Africa and other water in the Middle East. Very, very, very important. The second thing is it's not just the control over resources, but it's patronage, because in these societies, much of employment is the result of favoritism, government sponsored projects, and so forth. That the control over of these job-creating resources is crucial to the willingness to agree to a federal system. That said, I think we also have to emphasize, as I did at the close of my remarks, the irrational, affective, psychological, and cultural aspects of nation building, which sometimes operate against what, from the outside, we might see as economic rationality. So states are being formed today that are not viable, and federal systems will be constructed on terms that will, I think, reduce the economic prospects of some countries. So it's not, economics plays an extremely important role, but it can be trumped by other factors.
Professor Mallat, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's also because Peter raised the very crucial issue of oil, which I did not address at all in the talk, and correctly so as the curse of oil. Actually, the curse of oil is a phrase from one of the better thinkers, better statesmen of the 20th century in the Middle East, Kamal Jumblat, who was assassinated by the Syrians in 1977. Oil has acted as an extraordinary distorter in the Middle East because rentier economies have overtaken that relationship of democracy that the citizen has towards his government by way of taxation. Taxation does not exist in the Middle East because oil has been the glue. But it's a horrible glue. It's a glue that has prevented the natural development of things. But as Peter says, oil has become relative now. Partly, as you correctly point out, there's a knowledge economy. So it's not so much oil as the derivatives of oil, and the knowledge economy, which is separate from oil, that is increasingly putting oil in its hopefully less important dimension. But these are, I must confess, issues that very few people have devoted serious thinking about in the Middle East, because it gets trumped. It gets trumped by the land in Israel. I mean, the basic problem of federalism in Israel is over land and water. It gets trumped by patronage across the Middle East. It gets trumped by the lack of security, which means that economies are always on the verge of collapsing because the basic dimension of security is lacking. You're talking about the Sudan, you're talking about Iraq, and any or the West Bank. The basic lack of security makes the whole economic issue difficult to think through rationally.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, because if I know my colleague Michael Scharf well, and I do, he's going to start the next panel promptly at 11, and he'll be very angry if we don't wrap it up now. But if you join me again in thanking our two panelists.